Daniel Miller always considered himself a practical man. Moving into an old apartment in the city center seemed like a great decision, affordable, convenient, and, most importantly, a chance to leave the past behind. But from the very first days in the new building, something disturbed his peace. The silence in apartment 4B was strange. Not just the absence of sounds, but a feeling of emptiness, as if the walls held something hidden and dead. In the evenings, when Daniel sat at the table with a book, he began to hear a faint whisper. At first, he dismissed it as fatigue or imagination, but the whisper returned every night, becoming clearer and clearer. It was as if voices from the ventilation ducts were talking to each other, and sometimes addressing him by name. One night, Daniel woke up with the sensation that someone was standing by his bed. His gaze fell on the black ventilation grates, and in them he saw something that made his blood run cold. A faint movement, a shadow slipping along the inner walls. His heart pounded loudly. He tried to scream, but his voice got stuck in his throat. At that moment, the whisper sounded right by his ear. "They're still here." Daniel rushed to the door, but it slammed shut before him. In panic, he ran to the ventilation, trying to pull out the grate. Cold air hit his face, and behind him came a quiet but eerie laughter. Daniel struggled to catch his breath, leaning against the wall. His heart was still pounding wildly. He understood that with each day the situation only worsened. The whispers became more conscious and sinister. He couldn't find an explanation, but he felt the apartment was alive. Or perhaps something from the past didn't want to let go of those who came here. He decided to check the ventilation ducts. Taking a flashlight, Daniel carefully removed the grate. Inside was darkness, seeming as if a whole world lived within. Slowly, he reached his hand inside and felt a cold that ran through his whole body. The whispers suddenly stopped. For a minute, it seemed there was absolute silence around, but it was deceptive. Then, as if from nowhere, a quiet, barely distinguishable sound was heard, as if someone was scratching from the depths of the ducts. Daniel shuddered and quickly screwed the grate back, but the feeling of anxiety did not leave him. He began to look for information about the building, about past residents, trying to find at least some thread that would explain what was happening. At the local library, he discovered that once there was an old house on this site, where many years ago a tragedy occurred. A family disappeared under mysterious circumstances. No one was ever found, and apartment 4B was the last place they were seen. Daniel felt that now he, too, had become part of this grim story. He could not understand why the whispers called him specifically, but he knew this was far from the end. That night, when Daniel went to bed, he felt a cold shiver run through his whole body. The whisper did not stop. On the contrary, it became louder and clearer, filling the room with the sinister music of unseen voices. "They're waiting." It sounded right by his ear, as if someone was standing nearby. Daniel could not move, his heart pounding so hard it seemed it would burst out of his chest. He closed his eyes and tried to focus on his breathing, but the air felt heavy, as if soaked with fear. At dawn, he woke up in a cold sweat. Deciding not to stay in the apartment any longer, Daniel packed his things, but when he tried to open the door, it would not budge, as if an invisible force held it shut. In despair, he walked around the room, trying to find another way out. But the windows were closed and sealed so tightly that opening them was impossible. The whispers grew louder, turning into a hum that filled every corner of the apartment. At that moment, Daniel realized that the apartment was not just a home. It was a trap. He tried to open the door again, and suddenly it flung open with a crash. Freedom seemed so close. But stepping into the corridor, Daniel saw that the building had changed. The hallways stretched endlessly, and the walls were covered with strange inscriptions that he hadn't noticed before. And somewhere in the distance, a quiet child's cry was heard. Daniel stepped into the long corridor, feeling a cold piercing to the bone. Every step echoed as if the building lived its own life. The walls, covered with cracks and patches of mold, inspired more and more anxiety. The inscriptions, which had previously seemed like mere stains, now appeared clear, as if someone had deliberately carved them into the plaster. "Don't leave. They are here. Look in the shadows." The child's cry grew louder, breaking through the silence and darkness. Daniel felt something invisible pulling him forward, forcing him to go on, although his mind screamed, "Run." At one of the corridor's turns, he noticed a door he hadn't seen before. It was covered with old, rusty blotches, and the handle seemed to call him to touch it. Summoning all his will, Daniel turned the handle and opened the door. Inside was a small children's room. Old toys, torn books, scattered dolls. In the corner stood a swing that swayed slowly by itself. The crying became almost unbearable, and suddenly, from the shadows appeared a little girl. Her eyes were empty, as if reflecting all the pain and fear of this world. She looked straight at Daniel and said in a quiet, trembling voice, "Help us." Daniel stood, unable to look away from the girl. Her pale face, covered with a thin layer of dust, seemed ghostly. Her gaze was full of unspeakable sadness and a plea for help. "Who are you?" he managed to say, his voice trembling. The girl slowly came closer and whispered, "We are the Forgotten, those who remained within the walls of this house. We are trapped here, unable to leave." Daniel felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Suddenly the room became much darker, as if the light itself was swallowed by darkness. He heard voices, children's laughter, crying, whispering, which was now growing louder and more demanding. "Why do you hear us?" the girl asked. "I don't know," he replied, trying to find footing in this nightmare. "Because you are next," she said, and in her voice was both threat and sorrow. Daniel recoiled, feeling an invisible force envelop his body. He ran out of the room without looking back, striving to find an exit from this endless labyrinth. But the corridors seemed to change, leading him deeper into the heart of the building, where the whispers became almost screams, and the walls alive, contracting and breathing. He realized one thing. This house would not let him go so easily. In despair, Daniel rushed through the corridors, trying to find a familiar door, an exit, anything that resembled reality. But everything around was distorted, as if space was simultaneously shrinking and stretching. The walls whispered, echoing in his head, mixing reality and nightmare. Each whisper was like a drop of poison, penetrating deeper into his mind. He heard names, his own and unfamiliar, heard threats and pleas, calls and curses. The silence suddenly broke with a scream. childlike, painful, desperate. It was a cry of the soul, a call for help or a warning. Daniel did not know, but the feeling of hopelessness tightened its grip on him every minute. He stopped near a wall and leaned on it with his palms, trying to catch his breath. Suddenly his hand hit something cold and hard, an old yellowed photograph attached to the wall with a paperclip. Unfolding it, Daniel saw a family portrait, mother, father, and a little girl. Their faces were joyful, but on the back was a note written in illegible handwriting. They will never leave this house. Their souls are bound forever. At that moment, a thought flashed in his mind. This was the family that disappeared many years ago, and now their spirits possibly tied their fate to this place, and Daniel was their next prisoner. He desperately wanted to wake up, to get out of this nightmare. But his body did not obey. The house held him. The whispers turned into loud moans, the walls trembled, and the air filled with icy cold. Daniel realized he was on the edge, between life and what lurked beyond understanding. Suddenly, the silence was cut by the sound of creaking. The door through which he had tried to leave opened. Daniel froze, unable to believe his eyes. He rushed into the corridor, his heart torn by panic and hope. But instead of the familiar entrance, he found himself in a long, narrow tunnel. The walls covered with old newspaper clippings and photographs. He approached closer and saw that all the photos were faces of former residents of the building, many of whom had long been considered missing, without a trace. Under one of the clippings was a caption, "Last resident, missing without a trace." Daniel felt a cold chill to his bones. He realized that these souls, whispers, and shadows were not just a story, but a real trap for everyone who stepped into this building. Gathering his last strength, he decided to go to the end of the tunnel. Maybe there he would find an exit, or at least an answer. The tunnel wound endlessly, each step echoing, and suddenly he noticed a faint light ahead. Approaching, Daniel saw a door, old, wooden, with a carved symbol resembling an ancient rune. He felt the cold becoming unbearable, but could not stop. With effort, he pushed the door open. Behind it was an empty room, in the center of which stood an old wardrobe. Daniel slowly approached and opened it. Inside the wardrobe lay several yellowed items, a diary, dusty photographs, and an old amulet made of metal covered with mysterious runes. Daniel carefully took the diary and began to leaf through the pages. The handwriting was illegible, but between the lines he could guess the story of the family that lived here many years ago. They wrote about strange sounds, nighttime visits of shadows, and the feeling that someone was constantly watching them. The further he read, the more he felt that their horror was the same as his own. One of the last entries said, "If we disappear, our souls will remain in the house. Only someone strong can free us." Daniel felt the whispers fill the room again, now not sinister, but as if pleading. He raised the amulet and heard a voice, weak but clear. "Help us leave." At that moment, the room trembled, and he felt something invisible wrapping around him, like chains of the past. Daniel understood. To be freed, he must solve the house's mystery and help the souls find peace. He clenched the amulet in his hand and closed the diary. His mind was torn between fear and determination. He knew this was not just a house, but a place where time and space intertwined with tragedy. Recalling the notes, he realized he had to find a way to finish the family's unfinished business, to free their souls. Breaking free from stupor, he ran out of the room and headed to the stairs leading down to the building's basement. Legends said that there were keys to the mystery. Descending the creaky steps, Daniel felt the temperature drop with every minute. The dark corridors were lit only by the dim light of his flashlight. Suddenly, he heard a quiet crying, the same he had heard earlier in the apartment. He followed the sound until he saw a small room with locked doors. Acting on instinct, Daniel unlocked the door and entered. Inside it was cold and empty, but on the floor lay an old doll, the very same that had been in the children's room. Nearby, a note. "Find us. Free us." Daniel felt that he was uncovering a chain of events that bound him to this place. He carefully picked up the doll, feeling the cold to his bones. His mind tried to connect all the details, the photographs, the diary, the amulet, and now this doll. Suddenly, the walls of the room began to quietly vibrate, and the air was filled with a sense of anticipation. He remembered the words from the diary, that someone must finish the family's unfinished business so their souls can find peace. Weighing everything, Daniel realized he had to return to the apartment and find the place where it all began, the ventilation ducts. Returning to apartment 4B, he again removed the grate and reached his hand inside. This time inside, he felt not cold, but warmth that slowly spread through his body. The whispers changed. Now they sounded like gratitude, a plea for forgiveness. Daniel placed the amulet and the doll inside the ventilation and quietly said, "May your souls find peace." Suddenly the house trembled, the walls shook, and everything around was wrapped in thick silence. When the light returned, the apartment seemed empty, but calm. The whispers disappeared. Daniel left the building, feeling relief for the first time in a long while. He knew that now the house was free, and with it, he was too.